So then, we see these patients, and then let's say, there we're still in the millions of patients in the U.S. that have truly severe disease, whereby we can show either with biomarkers, exacerbations, et cetera, need for oral steroids, high-dose inhaled steroids. We've excluded all those alternative diagnoses, that they have this truly severe disease. Then we start to think about these targeted therapies. Right. So we have these different biologics. Curious to know, do you use them in your practice, and how do you decide when it's time to use those therapies?
So if you think about the first one we had, AntiIgE, omalizumab, it's been approved for asthma now since about 2003, I think.
16
we have about
years,
15 or 16 years experience with it. And this was a remarkable breakthrough, the treatment of asthma. So despite what we've all discussed about trying to manage asthma, ideally, the early studies with omalizumab showed that they were able to reduce asthma exacerbations by about 35 to 40% in these patients who were truly, allergic asthma patients who were truly refractory to therapy. And what was remarkable was the more severe the disease, the greater the magnitude of the exacerbation reduction. Really quite extraordinary. And it actually brings up a very interesting question as to how is this drug doing this? I mean, most of us, even though there's different phenotypes and endotypes of asthma, most asthma exacerbations are still virally induced. And how would an anti-IgE drug help with that problem? And it clearly does. The facts are there, exacerbations are reduced, and when looked at mechanistically in the inner city asthma study that Brad's been part of, you can show that it decreases viral-induced asthma exacerbations.
Both in ICATA and Prospero.
Yeah, quite remarkable.
I mean,
and now there's in vitro testing showing that the impaired antiviral response that we see in allergic asthmatics is restored.
Interferon response is restored,
by this anti-IgE, and possibly by the other biologics too. I think we might find out.
I think you'd expect to see that, given that we think that most exacerbations seem to be virally driven, and we're reducing exacerbations with these therapies. Nick, do you use biologics also in your practice?
Obviously, yes. But one has to keep in mind that biologics, right now, just like you mentioned earlier, if we know that biologic can alter the course of the disease, meaning cure asthma, we would be using them right up front. Currently, biologics are used as sort of the last resort if the patient is severe asthma, has failed current therapy, and continues to have symptoms, mainly because of the cost. Of course, it's a commitment, so whenever I decide to use a biologic, I sit with the patient. And there's quite a bit of overlap as a choice. We'll talk about that, but there is definitely a need for patient interaction and feedback on this, because we need his or her commitment. This is a long-term commitment. It's not a one-time deal. Often they need to come into the office twice a month, sometimes once a month. So cost is an issue, coverage is an issue. So we go over this before we step into it. But I do use biologics. We have limited number for certain type 2 high asthma, allergic asthma, eosinophilic asthma, and hopefully more to come. As I mentioned earlier, there are several studies ongoing.
Yeah, it's definitely been an evolution, and I think, if we're going from that time 15, 16 years ago, which is around the time I came out of training, to sort of where we are now, there's been a lot of advancement in our understanding and our options that are available. We also have a lot of challenges that we have to deal with. Obviously, you had mentioned cost being one of them.
Well, to take that a step further, then I'm going to ask the other two people on the panel, or the three, pardon me, on the panel, how many controllers do you think you need to expose a patient to before you consider a biologic?
Honestly, in my practice, almost all patients who go on biologic have been on three triple therapy, if not four.
I think so too. I think because of the cost.
Well.
I think at least 3, maybe even 4 controllers.
Yeah.
If you want to count montelukast or xifaxan as one, then it would be 4.
Do we have any concerns about the long-term use of these therapies?
Safety. It's interesting. So the first one to come out, we mentioned omalizumab, did have safety warnings with it. One of them, for example, was a warning about possible increased risk of malignancies across a broad range of malignancies, including skin, breast, lung, colon. It wasn't a statistically significant problem in the studies, but it was a numerical difference. However, in the fullness of time, further studies have been done, long-term follow-up. The Excel study ran over 5 years, had 7,500 patients, and that issue appeared not to be confirmed. So that was, I'm talking about in terms of joint decision-making with the patients, that was a really difficult discussion to have. That seems to have been addressed,
But
although
in the Excel study, then the cardiovascular thing
although,
came up.
as Brad is pointing out, another issue appeared to arise, increased cardiovascular events, venous occlusive disease, arterial occlusive disease. Again, numerical difference, but something we need to be worried about. With the newer agents, we don't have that length of experience to guide us. In the early clinical studies, they seem to be very safe and well tolerated, but yes, we do need to be concerned. These are important.
The other thing is anaphylaxis. I've never seen it in my patients, but it's certainly something to be aware of, at least
I've
with
had
a
two.
couple of them.
2 cases.
So several of my patients, I do use, epinephrine injections just for them to carry with them. We monitor these patients, and the first 3 times they get the injection they all get the injection in the office, but we keep them longer, like 4 hours. So in general, we're very familiar with omalizumab because it's been there longer and it has long-term safety studies. Most of the other biologics, they have 1 year. Actually, more recently with mepolizumab, there are 4-year studies published showing long-term safety.
Just building upon what Aidan had sort of talked about with regards to Excel, I think one of the challenges when we get sort of these open label trials, there are definitely methodological issues that can sort of come into play in interpreting the data, right? And so we have to be careful, I think, a little bit, especially with regards to cardiovascular risk, when you compare a moderate population of asthmatics to a severe population of asthmatics. How does that play into the safety? And I think, we can read between the lines. But I think generally speaking, it's not something that I have thought about when I think about these medications. I don't think about them as being immunosuppressive in any way, as some of the drugs that are used perhaps in the rheumatologic space might be. Right. And in general, I think our safety concerns, at least thus far, especially with Xolair, has been limited, and hopefully that is the case with these other therapies.